video, we're going to go over a couple different rules when creating or recording a macro. In this video, we're going to go over a couple different rules when recording a macro. All right, so if I'm just going to go ahead and pretend I record a macro right now, I'll click on the record macro button, and I get this little pop-up window here. And the first thing is it wants me to create a macro name. And we've seen this in the previous video, but just to recap, a macro name cannot have a space in there. So I couldn't do like really cool macro because there's two different spaces in here, one right there and one right there. So I could make this whole macro name what's known as camel case, and that's where each word is just capitalized. Or some people like a little bit more space in between there just to help read it a little bit better, and they'll separate the different words with underscores. Okay, so that's just one little naming convention, is that a macro name cannot have any spaces in there. And I also believe it cannot start with a number either. I think if I were to do that, that would also be an error. So it must start with a letter. Okay. This next option here is store macro in. In this case, we want this one, or in the previous macros we created, we just left this as the default, and that is this workbook. And that means that this macro will always be attached to this workbook and only this workbook. So that's becomes a little bit problematic when we want to share this macro with someone else, because we can't just share the macro itself. We have to share the entire worksheet. So it becomes, the macro essentially becomes tied to this actual worksheet, and it's not really adaptable to other worksheets. So instead what we could do is use a personal macro workbook. And that's what this one does here. So now we could actually share the macro with other people so they could insert it into their own workbooks. The shortcut key, this one's really cool. We can actually assign a shortcut key to very quickly execute this macro. So we saw beforehand what we had to do before in order to run our macros. We would click on this macros button, and then this would bring up all of our macros that we've ever created, and we would have to select which one we wanted to execute, and then we would click run. Or instead, we can create a shortcut key for this. So in a Mac, it says option plus command plus whatever key you want to do. In a Windows or a PC, what you will see here instead is, instead of option plus command, you're probably going to see control. And now both of these different options come by default depending on what operating system you have. For me, I'm on a Macintosh right now. So by default, it's always going to be option plus command plus whatever key I want it to be. So let's say I want it to be R, or T, or G. Now those are all fine, but what I like to personally do, just because it's a little bit safer, is to make sure I put a shift in there. And notice how in a Mac, it now shows Control plus Shift plus F. And the reason I want to put that in there is because, let's say for instance I do S. Well, the shortcut key in Windows is just Control S, right? Or let's say C. And then the control for to copy in Windows is just Control C or Control V for paste. And if you create a macro that essentially overrides an already shortcut key, well, now you lose that functionality. So if I created this macro here as Control C inside Windows, well, now every time I wanted to copy and paste, I couldn't use Control C anymore, because now it's overwritten with whatever this macro happens to be. So that's why I like to just be a little bit more safe with it, and I'll do a shift. So now it's Control Shift C, or Control Shift V, or Control Shift S, or Control Shift P. That way I know I'm not going to be really overwriting a current command already, or a current shortcut key rather. And then for the description box, you can give it a description which just sort of helps describe why you made this macro in the first place. Maybe this macro does like 100 different tasks, and when you start making lots of macros, you can give a really, really detailed macro name, and that'll help, describe it a little bit. But when you start getting in like, dozens or even hundreds of different macros for like enterprise level worksheets, it'll start getting really confusing trying to differentiate all the different macros that you have. So it would be really helpful to give a really detailed description on each single one. And that's all the information I want to provide in this video. So in the next video, we will continue on with learning more about macros.